Today I'm going to show you how I built this noodle board, or this stovetop cover. I'm going to take you along for pretty much the whole process of it. So it may be a rather lengthy, detailed video, and I'm sorry if that's not what you're after, but this shows you how I build these boards. It's not necessarily the best way, definitely not the only way, but it's just the way that I build these stovetop covers. So how about we go back to yesterday when I actually started this project. We are starting this project off with a 1x12. I know that may kind of seem a little bit strange, but I have found that 1x12s work the best for these, and I'll show you what we're going to do with it. But first, I've got to go dig out a 1x12 over here. The standard size of these noodle boards or stovetop covers is normally 30 inches wide. So we are going to cut this 1x12 down to 30 inches long. And I'm going to do this times 2 because we're going to need 2 pieces to make this noodle board. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this down to 30 inches long. Then we'll move to the next step. We're also going to need some of the side pieces on these noodle boards. So they come out to like 21 inches in kind of the depth there. We're going to make these like 21 and an 1/8, just something just a little bit over. Just make sure that you have some room. I'll show you how we're going to flush trim that later. So I just found a 1x6 that'll actually work better. So instead of using my 1x12, I'm going to go ahead and cut this down now to my length, which is the 21 and an 1/8. I do go ahead and cut the rough edges off in case you didn't notice last time. I just don't like these rough factory edges on this, so I do go ahead and trim that up. That is all of the cuts that we're going to have to make on the miter saw. We are going to rip these down now, and this piece that I have here, it's a good straight edge. I think this will rip great here on the table saw, and I think this one may have been something that was actually already cut out of something else, so it is a good straight flat edge. These factory edges here are a little bit rounded over, just like what you get from any of the big box stores, and you can run this along your table saw and it'll be just fine. I have a joiner, so I'm going to joint this edge to make sure it is flat and straight. So I'm going to take this over to the joiner, and I'm going to do that first. If you don't have a joiner, don't worry about it. I think you'll be fine with this. We're ready to rip these boards down now, and I'm going to use this table saw, but I have a remote that is connected to my shop vac, which kind of has a dust cyclone on it. It's called the Dust Deputy. And this connects to my table saw, so it tries to pull some of the sawdust out. And I just have it on one of these little cheap remotes that I got off of Amazon, and it'll remote control pretty much anything you have a receiver onto. As you can see, I have the receiver plugged into the outlet. My vacuum is just connected to that. And this remote, this actual model will control 3 different receivers around the shop. So I can turn it on. And it's as simple as that. And so I'm going to be using this to turn that on while I'm cutting. So it may be kind of loud here, but yeah. We're going to rip these down. For the side rails, we're going to rip these down to 2.5 inches wide. So I'm just going to set my table saw for that. And since this doesn't have to be exactly precise, I am just using the little guide here on the table saw. I know that it is very close for mine. It is at least close enough for this. So I'm just going to set it for 2.5, and I'm going to rip 2 strips here at 2.5 inches wide out of this 21 1/8 inch piece. Set my blade height and let's go. And these are our 2 rails or 2 sides, so they're finished. Let's move on to the actual pieces that make the noodle board. And these are going to get ripped down to 5 1/4 inch each. So let's just set that up. And as you can see, these job site table saws don't do a really good job at sucking all the dust. It's blowing a lot of sawdust up at me. And yeah, so I usually have my filter fans running, but it's kind of hard in here when you're shooting video for that. But yeah, here we go. Now I'm just going to make sure and reference the side that I jointed, make sure that I'm running this along my fence. Now that we have all of our pieces cut out, it is time to lay this out in the order that kind of looks good with the grain. And also you want to kind of make sure that your grain pattern is not running the exact same way. Look at the end of your boards, and you don't want all of them cupping one direction. You want to change your grain pattern up. So we're going to look at that. We're going to be rotating some of these boards over until we get it the way that we want it. Once we have an idea of how we want this positioned, I find that it's easier right then to sand it before you assemble anything here. It's just going to make it a lot easier if you want a pretty good smooth finish on these. It works a lot better than it does after you get your side rails on this. So we're going to go ahead and sand it like it is. And before I do that, I like to mark these, and I'll mark it on the ends to show me kind of which direction that I need them. The numbering, however you feel that you need to mark them, that's fine. Just that way you know the position of these. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to get to sanding these. I'm going to start with 80 grit, and because there is some rough places on here, so I'm going to start with 80 grit. Let's get to sanding this. I do wear a respirator while I am sanding. It is just the best practice. And so yeah, I'd get a respirator if you're going to be doing very much sanding at all. The sanding is finished now, and I actually went, like I said, from 80 grit to 120 grit, and then up to 150 grit on both faces of each one of these boards for the side pieces and the pieces that'll make up our noodle board. So yeah, that was quite a bit of sanding, but that is finished now, and that is pretty much honestly the most time-consuming part of this project, really. And I stopped at 150 painting this one, so I mean, there's really no need to go any higher than 150. And also, whether you're staining or painting, make sure that you don't over sand these. I actually over sanded one that I was staining one time, and the stain that I was using said to stop at 180, and I sanded to 220 without reading that can, and the stain just did not take on the boards hardly at all. You would put it on there and almost all of it wiped back off. So make sure that you read that before you sand, so you'll know kind of where to go to. But that's pretty much it. I need to shut my fan filters off. I've had them running, so I'm not sure exactly how that's going to sound on the audio. Let me shut them off before we move on to the next step. We are ready to assemble this noodle board. And like I said before, this isn't just the only way to do things. This isn't necessarily the best way to do it. This is just how I build these. So I am going to use clamps and nails for this. I don't glue this board because I want to allow for some expansion and contraction of the wood. So that's just going to happen over time. So I use nails in these. So yeah, it's time to lay this all back out, and we'll clamp these down and nail them to the board. So let's get it going. I am going to use several of these clamps. These are just the cheap clamps from Harbor Freight, but they work really well for what I need to do with them. And so yeah, we've got this all lined up, made sure they have the right order. The grain pattern looks good. Everything's sanded now, so yeah, it's much easier. Now we're going to grab our sides, and basically I'm just going to look, and if there is any knots or something, I try to put that kind of down on the bottom against the board. That way it's not up here on the edge. So this one looks pretty good. I'm just going to place this down here. Now you notice that we did cut it slightly 1/8 of an inch long, so it won't match up perfectly. That's fine, just keep it that way, and we'll trim that down later. But I'm also going to inset this rail inside just a little bit, so I'm going to let the side pieces hang over just a hair. I mean, like 32nd of an inch or something like that, just so you can come back and flush trim this later. So yeah, we're going to get that right where we need it and clamp it down. And I am clamping this on the seams. I'm doing this to both sides here. So I'm using 10 of these little cheap clamps. If you don't have this many clamps, surely you can do just one side at a time, but I find it's easier for me to go ahead and do both sides. I think you can see in that shot there how I leave this just a little bit proud on the bottom. And then if we try to come around here to the side, and if you look here on the side, this has just a slight overhang on the top rail, and that's the way we want it. So that way the top rail is just a hair long. Now that we have it clamped, I'm going to flip it over. And I'm using my DeWalt 16 gauge nail gun here. It has 1¼ inch nails in it. If you don't have a nail gun, you can just do this with hammer and nails, but I'm just going in right here, pretty much going to put 4 nails per slat or per board in here. And I'm just going right close to the clamp. You just want to make sure that you don't extend and come out the side of your bottom rail. So be kind of conscious about where this rail sticks out here. You can see how I put 2 nails kind of beside each clamp right there. Since this is for a flat top stove, you want to make sure all the nails sunk down completely into the wood. There is one right here that didn't get completely in, so I'm going to go ahead and take my clamps all off now. And I can get in here to this and use something like an awl and go ahead and tap that in. Now that we have all the nails down in there flush, that way nothing can scratch the stovetop. We're going to have felt pads on it anyways, but we just always like to make sure those nails are completely flush in there. And now this is really pretty good. If you had any high spots, now would be a really good time to go ahead and go back and sand over this again to make sure you get it pretty good and flat. But everything's pretty good here on the bottom. We'll turn it over. And this is the front. And as you can see, this is pretty much the basic gist of the noodle board. And everything looks pretty good. You can still come back if you need to and sand the tops of these, get some sanding in here. But it was just much easier to go ahead and do the bulk of it first. But now we are going to move on to a router. And this is so we can flush trim the edges. And if you don't have a router, then you can sand them down. But I have a flush trim bit on my router, and we are going to flush trim all of the edges here on the sides and on the rails and make this thing really nice and smooth. So that's what we're going for now. This is the flush trim router bit that I'm using. Has a little guide here. So yeah, this is just a Bosch flush trim bit. And I'll try to leave links to everything that I'm using, or at least most of everything I'm using, down in the description below this video. So now I have the router all set up. I am going to clamp this to the table so it doesn't go anywhere. And I'm going to start with the edges or the sides here. So I flipped it upside down simply because that's the way that my flush trim router bit is set up. So now I'm just going to clamp this in a couple places on the table so it doesn't go anywhere. I use bigger clamps. This is also a good time if you're using the router. It can be pretty loud right by your ears, so it's a good time for hearing protection. You might want to step up your eye protection because sometimes these chips can really fly. And also, I would go back to wearing your respirator for this as well. So let's get suited up. All right, so the sides now are flush. That does a good job. It sometimes leaves just like a little indentation, so we will go ahead and probably sand over these when we're finished, but the sides are flush. Now I have turned the noodle board over, and I'm gonna flush trim these pieces here. So it's time to suit back up and go ahead and flush trim this. Now that everything is all flush trimmed, everything's really nice. It's kind of optional here what you want to do with this. Some people like to just leave these fairly sharp. I would at least try to smooth them over or ease the edges over if you want to with a little bit of sandpaper. But I actually go ahead and put a round over bit in my router and go around the top edges of these and also the bottom edge of the noodle board. This like the front and back edge, I just ease that over, but I like to put a round over around all of this. It just seems to make it nice. So that's what I'm gonna do now. If you don't want to do that, then that's fine. You can skip this step and just ease the edges over with sandpaper. Now that we're finished with the router, I'm gonna go back to sanding with that same 150 grit that I was using before, and the areas where we trimmed it up with the flush trim and then also the round over, I'm just going to kind of ease that over there and make sure that everything is good and smooth. It is all finished with sanding now, and if you've never used one of these are great. It's called a sanding mouse, and it uses those same disc that you use for your orbital sander. So yeah, it's great. It goes on here, and I find this to be the easiest way to do this when you need to hand sand something. So it's perfect. But now, since we're finished with sanding, we are off to paint this. If you was going to stain it, you could stain it or distress it, whatever you want to do. But this customer just wants this painted black, so we're off to the paint room now to go ahead and get this painted. This is my paint room, and so I'm fixing to paint this, but before I do, I'm going to use a tack cloth to go ahead and try to get some of the dust that is still on here. I'm going to try to get as much of that off as I can before I paint it. After using the tack cloth, I still will go over it one more time with the air hose just to try to make sure and get as much dust off as I can. I'm just going to spray paint this, and one of my favorite spray paints to use is this Rust-Oleum. It's Painter's Touch 2X. It has paint and primer both together, and I prefer the satin sheen. So this is just the, it's called Canyon Black Satin, and I'm starting with the back of this. Pretty much know how to spray paint, I'm sure, but I'm just going to start with the back of this. I'll get probably 2-3 coats on this, then flip it over, do the top part of it, and then I'll be done. So I'm going to get to painting. Okay, the painting part is finished for now. I did actually have to switch for the final coat. I went with a semi-gloss, the same kind of paint. It just, while this was drying, for some reason, the sheen wasn't as quite as shiny as I normally get out of the satin. I'm not sure if it's something with the wood or how it's drying today. I really don't know. But so I went for the final coat with a semi-gloss just to give it a little bit more shine. But now this is finished painting. I'm going to leave it overnight to dry. I'll be back here in the morning to finish it up, and I'll see you then. The paint has dried overnight, and now I'm ready to install handles on it. I'm just installing some of these plain black handles on this board. And what I'm using to put these on here with is a centering drill bit. I actually really like this. It helps you when you're trying to drill a hole in the exact center. So I'm going to use this centering drill bit to install these handles. So here we go. Just find the center point. So once we have this lined up, I'll just hold a little pressure there. Take my centering drill bit. Drill me a small hole right there. I have my holes ready. And with these little screws, I don't like using a power drill to install them. I like just using a hand screwdriver. That way I don't over tighten them. The handles are installed, so now let me grab some felt pads that we can put on the bottom of this. This is just some styrofoam blanks that I had here. They come in some packing material, and they work great to lift things up. But since I'm going to be turning this upside down, I do cover it with some paper just to protect the top of this. These are just some stick-on felt pads that I got. They're about 1 inch in diameter, and you just peel the backs of them off and stick them on. That's what we're doing now. And I just stick one of these on all 4 corners. Now that the felt pads are installed, let's flip it over. And there we have it. This is a design that we made, and we cut the vinyl and went ahead and installed this off camera. If you're interested in this, a few months ago, I actually made a video here on this channel showing you how I cut and install all of this vinyl. So yeah, I'll link that video in the description below this video, and possibly you'll see it up here in the card. If you want to see a little more in-depth on the whole cutting and installing this decal process. But this is it. This is the finished noodle board. Now it's ready to go to a customer. Since this was the flat top, we didn't have to put any of the runners on the back. But if you were doing something for a raised electric burner, then you would need to put some runners. And that video I talked about, it actually shows those runners that I have on that one, because that other video was for a raised burner stove. But that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the process of building, painting, and finishing this noodle board, this stovetop cover, whatever you want to call it. Thanks for joining me for this rather lengthy shop video. I hope that someone got some value out of this. If you did, be sure and hit that like button or leave me a comment down below. I would greatly appreciate it. Thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing. And until next time, God bless.